I read all of the summaries of your projects and your backgrounds, and recognize that most of you are not going to be working on Central and Eastern Europe. But what I will do is try to place it in some kind of comparative perspective for those of you who are much more interested in Eurasia. I, in fact, am an old Soviet specialist, so I worked on both Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union during communism, and I still maintain an interest in Russia, and particularly the Caucasus area. What I thought I'd do, and it was hard to know what would be most useful for you, and I'm really happy to be interrupted with questions, etc., although because they're taping this, I'm not allowed to walk around. I kind of like to act more like a talk show host when I'm talking than in part because I don't hear well, but in part because I hate to be rooted in one place. But anyway, we'll move on. But what I thought I'd do is do a very quick historical discussion that moves back and forth between some events in the region and the ways in which people analyze them. And one of the things I think that's important in talking about this is to understand that what was going on in the region and what people worked on didn't necessarily correlate all that well. So what people chose to focus on, the development of the study of Eastern Europe, had a life of its own, not surprisingly, as well as being rooted in various things going on. Let me just say a few words briefly about the interwar period, because I think that what was interesting about the interwar period in Eastern European studies, there are a couple of things I wanted to emphasize. One, of course, is that is the beginning of the theme that we see over and over again in Eastern and Central Europe. That is to say, the simultaneous construction of states, new economies, and new regimes. It's also the beginning of we can do this from above, in effect. We can engineer the transformation of this region. It also brings open the theme of Eastern Europe did not have control. I'm using the old-fashioned term here. Did not have any control over what happened to it. That it was situated as it is today between some very big players that had excuse me, enormous impact on what happened in the region. And so the work on the region, I think, and it was done more by British scholars than by American scholars in the interwar period, and the British scholars were, interestingly enough, also very tuned in, which they continued after the Second World War, with issues of nationalism. And they also had, frankly, the language training that the American scholars did not, and of course there was the historical engagement of the British Empire in the region, among other things, sort of ancillary to the issue of the Great Game and the struggles among empires, the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the longest dying empire one can imagine, and how that affected British politics. But what I wanted to emphasize about the interwar period that's interesting, to me at least, in rethinking about it, is how many of the issues came back after communism, and how many of the same sets of debates, the same sets of issues kept returning. What I've already said, obviously, about how do you build new states, how do you do that simultaneously with new regimes and new economies, can you in fact structure a whole economy from the top and a whole regime from the top as opposed to an evolutionary model, which the West often had the luxury of having, in part because of where Eastern Europe was and the ways in which it absorbed the shocks and the problems of the larger region within which it was encased. But also, this is the beginning of the debate over civic and ethnic nationalism is really in the interwar period. Nationalism defined by territory versus nationalism defined by something more fundamental and basic having to do with genetics, whatever, kinds of things. So that is an issue that pops up. Another issue that pops up in interwar studies that we see again is democratic breakdown. Not just transitions to democracy, which was what the 1920s were about in much of Eastern and Central Europe, but also democratic breakdown by the end of the 1920s. Many of the debates that surrounded democratic breakdown in most of these countries, with the exception, obviously, of Czechoslovakia, though the Slovaks argue there was a democratic breakdown as far as they noticed. But the Czechs didn't seem to really notice that in the interwar experience. But many of the debates are the same. The artificiality of democracy, the problem of the wrong class structure for democracy, the problem of development for democracy, large peasant classes for democracy, the problem of bad institutional design, which made it easy, among other things, for democratic institutions to work badly and to open up for possibilities of political coups d'etats and the like, and insertions of the military in politics. So I'm bringing this up because I think it is important to see the repetitious character of the issues. That in the interwar period, the struggle was very similar in terms of what people were working on to the struggle that we find after communism. Okay, let me say a few words, and again, please feel free to interrupt me. I'm rushing through things very, very quickly. Let me say a few words about the rise of communism and just say that this is when, of course, Eastern European studies becomes infused with enormous political baggage. How people understood, you could come up with an easy story that fit very well into the Cold War understanding of things, which was that the Red Army had to get to Berlin, and the way to do that was, in effect, to take over all of Eastern Europe on the way. But what we know is a much more complicated story. And in terms of research that is important, I think, to put out there at least briefly. And that was that the Red Army had a plan for some places and not for others, number one. Number two, there were significant differences domestically. Excuse me. Significant differences domestically in political support, not just for democracy, but also on the left, what the left wanted. And so to understand, one way to think about many countries, I think, in Eastern and Central Europe at the time, and there's a wonderful novel, Ashes and Diamonds, I think, that captures this very well, is that no one knew where they were going. And there wasn't a natural consensus that existed, given the interwar experience and the horrible experiences of World War II. It was like a big pillow, waiting in many ways to be punched in. Excuse me, I'm an allergy to this room or something. Okay, so so that's one important. So there was a lot of variation. There was a lot of variation in local support. There were also variation in how it happened, how quickly it happened, quick in Romania, slow in Czechoslovakia, etc. So the real point here for people who worked on the region was trying to get beyond a kind of simplistic understanding to deal with the complexity of the individual Eastern European cases. This was also complicated by the rush into the field of immigrant scholars, some of whom had specific access to grind and some of whom were able to step back and have very rich analyses of what was going on. But it also introduced another issue which I think the study of Eastern and Central Europe struggled with for a long time, and that is, was it simply an appendage of Soviet studies? Or was it something in its own right that could be analyzed? Now, let me turn, because I think it is important to remember communism and the communist experience. And I mean that for two reasons. I'm a political scientist, so of course I'm skewing all this much more towards a kind of a political understanding of the important variables, and Michael Kennedy will keep me honest by reminding me that there is something called sociology, among other things. But what is really important about remembering communism, I think personally, is that it's simply been erased from social scientists' understanding of authoritarianism. It is, to me, remarkable how fickle and present-oriented social scientists are. There is a huge outgrowth, which some of you may be aware of, a huge growing interest in authoritarianism among political scientists, as well as, for that matter, economists, people who do formal work as well. And the communist experience is missing completely, as though it never happened. And you could say, well, it's dead in most places. But the important thing is that it is a part of authoritarianism, and it alerts us to contemporary authoritarianism because of the comparative standard it provides. I've been very, very concerned about this issue, and I co-teach a course on authoritarianism with a young colleague of mine whom I dearly love, who was trained at Stanford and who thinks that leaders get up and manipulate everything and there's individual rationality and blah, 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 because that's the way he was trained. But when I say, well, we need to have readings on communism, why? And some of you may know, for example, Steve Kotkin's book on Magnitogorsk, which I think is a great book. But one of the things is really wonderful about it is that it reminds you of two things that were very important in understanding communism: the missionary zeal and the chaos, despite the planning. And that those are the two themes I see in the Magnitogorsk book, the kind of unbelievable ambitions of this project, purportedly planned and truly chaotic on the ground. The more ambitious, the more chaotic, perhaps one could argue almost as a hypothesis. But at any rate, just a sidestep on the issue of authoritarianism. But let me say that I was thinking back on the evolution of communism, and of course, most of us who worked in the field, I am old enough to have spent not quite half my career on communism, so of course I also miss it in certain ways. But well, all the stupid things I had to know, and it seems like I should get to trot out just at least a little bit of those dumb things that I had to know, like Brezhnev's scientific technical revolution. I mean, boy, now that was a gripping drama. It was just really deadly. But at any rate, there are some important things to understand, I think, about the evolution of communism, and much of that was really captured much more frankly. I'm someone who straddled Soviet and East European studies and often worked on Soviet bloc relations, as well as doing some work on Yugoslav-Soviet relations. And what was interesting about work on Eastern and Central Europe, or we called it Eastern Europe then, is that it was much, much more sensitive to change. Much more, one might also argue, to be fair, interested in the possibility of change. One, to keep us awake. Brezhnev was really deadly. But the second thing was that it generated a research agenda for people. If you thought the system wasn't moving or going anywhere or nothing was happening, there were no tensions, it was a well-oiled machine that didn't really change over time, then, what do you work on? But what happened, I think, is that in Eastern European studies, first of all, there were things that enriched it much more than Soviet studies, I think. And one is that we had multiple cases. Now, people who worked on the Soviet Union did do comparisons of Soviet republics, for example, but frankly, the database for that was really skimpy. It was very hard to get to those places. It was very hard to collect information about them and the like. And there were some studies, I remember, like Joel Moses, a few others, of local politics in the Soviet Union, but it was hard to get there. So one is that you had a lot more cases so you could compare them, and you were sensitive to the fact that communism meant different things in different places. That Polish communism was not Romanian communism. And one of the great lines about Romanian communism, socialism in one family, that was very close to, a very personalized dictatorship. But it had to do with how much state control and ownership there was in the economy. It had to do actually with how large and inclusive the Communist Party was. It had to do with the area of room for media and personal maneuver, the possibility of a kind of a civil society versus the not possibility of such a thing, and the like. There were very different patterns of political mobilization. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia were the protesting cases. The others were not so much, although you began to see minor strikes towards the end in the last 10 years or so in Romania and the like. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that, in a way, there's several issues. Eastern European studies was very sensitive to issues and very interested in issues of autonomy from the party state, carving out autonomy, mobilizing against the party state apparatus, locating areas of greater freedom of maneuver. That also meant that most of the work in the field was on the more liberal regimes, which tolerated this for a variety of different reasons. That is to say, most of us worked on Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Very few people worked on Czechoslovakia because after 1968, it was pretty shut down. Very hard to do things. They had so-called normalization, and that tightened the regime, even though there was the end of killing people who disagreed with the party state. At the same time, no economic reform and very few liberalizing political reforms, none actually in Czechoslovakia, whereas Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, you could do research. You could go there. You could actually talk to academics who were doing research. You couldn't do that in Moscow. You really could not. I mean, I think about going between Warsaw and Moscow, it was night and day. It was absolutely night and day. You simply you didn't have the infrastructure of people, research, the openness of the system, et cetera, to really do nearly as much. So what happened, I think, under communism is not just that Eastern Europe became the antechamber of innovation and pressures for change within the Soviet bloc, as did Yugoslavia, of course, which was not really in the bloc. But it also transformed the two sets of studies in really important ways. Eastern European studies was more diverse, more interested in change, more interested, again, in protest, more interested in party-state versus society relations. And Soviet studies was much more interested in the elite. What the elite were doing, what they were working on, how they were organized, et cetera. Now, let me say a few words about evidence here, because it is interesting. I think, how did we figure out during communism, how did we have the chutzpah to write things where we had such poor access? That's what I always look back on and blush, and think, I knew so little when I wrote that. It's just terrifying, because when communism collapsed, suddenly you had access in a way that you just didn't have before. But what did you use for information? Well, I mean, basically, you used a variety of indicators from which you could extrapolate logical things. For example, speeches. If you saw differences in speeches, you could assume that, by the top leadership, you could assume that there were tensions within the leadership and debates within the leadership. And these things, especially since they varied over time, meant that you could get some kind of sense of expansion, contraction of inter-party conflict. A lot of work I did, a lot of people did, was on looking at policies and using those policies to extrapolate backwards to what kinds of politics, what kinds of economics would produce such policies. So that was it was a very indirect method of trying to get at what was going on. Let me also say, in continuing this theme of looking at Soviet versus Eastern European studies, there were some other interesting differences, not just what we worked on and all that stuff. Eastern European studies was a smaller field. It was more ideologically diverse. You had people all over the ideological map. There was some degree of that also in Soviet studies, although maybe Mark would, I don't know if Mark would agree with me, more in history than in political science, I would say. In history, I would make a different generalization about the ideological side. More mixed positions on the regimes. People were writing on, why these regimes will always endure, and they were writing on why they're going to fall tomorrow. So that was interesting. Another interesting thing, this was really true, I thought about this a lot. For some reason, Eastern European studies was much more female than Soviet studies, much more. I remember, because I went to both sets of conferences, and I can tell you, all those guys, and the bombs and bullets and everything, I mean, this was, they were doing a superpower. And we were just doing the piddly little empire. And so there was a very clear distinction. And if you think back on it, it's hard to come up with many major female specialists on the Soviet Union. Now, Condi Rice came in at the last minute. She was late in the game. Gail Lapidus, it's hard to come up with many. Whereas in Eastern European studies, you could just There are a lot. There were a lot. So we can think about why that might be. I won't belabor it, but it's interesting. But as I said, more comparative, more disciplinary influenced. I don't know if Tim Fry, has Tim been here yet, or is he coming? Yeah, Tim might want to hit me for this one, but I think that Eastern European studies was just much more ready for the collapse. Full stop. Why was that? Well, one, we've been doing change. We've been doing dissident communities. And some of us had this person had published an article which made people extremely mad at me in Eastern Europe, saying that the Soviets ought to dump Eastern Europe because it was sucking the blood out of the Soviet Union. But I, of course, put it in much nicer social science terminology about the cost of empire for the Soviet Union and its dominance over Eastern Europe. But we were imagining tensions, contradictions, exits. We were imagining challenges, writing about those challenges, and the like. And we were also, I think, more connected to disciplinary discussions of transitions to democracy and issues like that. When you do a superpower, when you do the big one, you have an enormous amount invested in that big one staying around and that big one being there forever. Or moreover, frankly, superpowers just don't usually exit, let alone implode. That isn't the usual way history plays out. But the point is that they were also very much focusing on the party state. The other interesting thing I'll just say, that was always fascinating to me, I often went from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe during communism. And virtually no Soviet specialists did that. And if they did that, they would have seen very clearly how disastrous the Soviet economy was. You go to Moscow, and as a Russian friend of mine said, my God, it's a third world country. It was really a jaw-dropper if you went from Budapest to Moscow. And I remember one time, not to get into too many memories, but I followed around a Russian tour group in Yugoslavia, and they were just furious at how the Yugoslavs were living. This is before Yugoslavia started going down the tubes, but they were furious at the consumption level. And they said, boy, they were essentially saying, we should have left the bloc too. That was it. They played this one right. So there was a lot of, I would say, I'm telling tales out of school a little bit, there was a lot of insularity in Soviet studies. It was a big field. It was studying a superpower. It was studying the other big nuclear power, et cetera. And that put them in a much more difficult, I think, position for imagining a very different set of scenarios in terms of political, economic, social regime trajectories, let alone relations of these states to the international system. Let me say let me now turn to what I guess I was supposed to do the most of, which is to say post-communism, and talk a little bit about that and how we've done things. Obviously, one of the things that's been a huge shock is we now have too much data. It doesn't seem right that we should have gone from too little to too much. And it has been, for many of us, unbelievably overwhelming. We used to rely on the official media and statistical reports, and sometimes, depending on where we were working, we could also do some interviews, and we could link with some sociologists. Now we have all this stuff, this public opinion, and we actually have decent social and economic data. The problem during the communist period is that the economic data were very bad. And you always had to put in sentences whenever you were working from it to apologize that I'm working with it, but I know it stinks. And then the logical question is, then why'd you work with it? Well, it's the drunk looking for the light, the key under the light. It's you worked with what you had. You tried to make heroic assumptions about let's reduce the growth rate by 20%. Let's figure out that they have these problems with double counting, et cetera. But suddenly now we have, among other things, the transition to real statistics. real economic and social statistics, which are just not, it's a transition that's not fully completed. But one of the interesting things about EU accession, of course, is that there's a radical transformation in the statistical systems and how data are collected and the quality of the data and the like. What have we worked on under post-communism? I think that we're all confronting, in some ways, one very fascinating question. And this follows in the former Soviet Union Eurasia case, too. This was, in a lot of ways, although one doesn't want to overstate it, a relatively homogeneous system under communism. There was a limited number of states. They followed the Stalinist model, which had been developed in the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia obviously diverged from that to a certain degree. But in many ways, they kept with some certain kinds of issues, certain kinds of structural things. And what happened, of course, is that suddenly, we had 27, now 29 cases. Kosovo, Montenegro have added since the early breakup. We have all these cases. And what we find is huge diversification of the region in a way that really caught us by surprise. Now, the source of that diversity of the region, and here I'm talking about the entire space, including the former Soviet Union, the sources of that are multiple, and we should be clear about it. When these states broke up, that is Czechoslovakia, it's not so relevant there, yes, Yugoslavia, yes, the former Soviet Union, the spatial variation, socioeconomically, linguistically, ethnically, blah, 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 of course was highlighted and advertised. Tajikistan is one of the poorest countries in the whole space. It was not that noticeable when there was a Soviet Union. Similarly, if you look at Macedonia versus Slovenia in the former Yugoslavia. So part of it is simply a state breakup issue, that as you multiplied your cases, you highlighted the extremes in a way, and this goes with party development, this goes with all other variables. I'm just using economics and things as a kind of convenient example. So that happened. But the second thing that happened, which was really interesting, is that it turned out that these different entities were very differently set up to move in certain directions. I'll put it straightforwardly. No one, I don't think, maybe Mike would disagree with me, but no one imagined that Poland would not go democratic. I mean, that was a no-brainer. But I don't know if Mike was, I was shocked. It not only went, stayed, flowered, consolidated, boom, boom. It was the speed of the new democracies that really stunned me. Not that they would go in that direction, but that there would be such an amazingly successful transition, as well as with capitalism. I was stunned by the speed of the so-called winners of the transition, the success cases. So one of the things that happened in the region is that some places really took off in terms of democracy and capitalism, thereby creating, again, an extreme. And that's been what we've been interested in. In other cases, when communism collapsed, most of the region was what we call hybrid regimes. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but this is a new kind of regime that has popped up during the third wave of democratization, although reality, Weimar Germany was a hybrid regime. But anyway, it's only been written about over the past 20 years. And these are regimes that are these weird combinations of democracy and dictatorship. In other words, they don't go for one or the other, but they straddle. What does that mean in practice? Well, they often have authoritarian leaders. They often don't have fully rule of law. They often have competitive elections, but it's not on an even playing field, so that some sets of players are favored over other sets of players. So you have this big gray zone. If you imagine democracy and dictatorship, you have this big gray zone where, to quote Adam Jaworski, for example, there's no fundamental consensus on the political rules of the game. There's not one game going on. There's a mixture of political games going on, some of which are democratic and some of which are authoritarian. Does this make sense? Okay, I can't tell from you. Thank you for nodding. Yeah. So what happened when communism collapsed, and at that point, after state dissolution, end of 1992, there were 27 cases in the region. A majority were these mixed regimes. They weren't really fully democratic, but they weren't really fully authoritarian. They had electoral competition, but it wasn't really quite right. They had civil liberties and political rights, but they weren't always respected, et cetera. So there was this funny amalgam that went on. And what's happened since then, politically, well, let me just say a little bit economically. The democracies, and I was surprised by this, I don't know if others were, the democracies went to capitalism pretty quickly and pretty effectively, even if we could talk about the various costs to it. But that process, which we thought would blow out democracy because of the kinds of costs that it necessarily incurred, didn't happen. The hybrid regimes, like Russia, for example, these mixed regimes in the 90s, they ended up doing various kinds of economic transitions, but basically they had the worst economic disasters of anybody. And then the regimes that basically never noticed the communism collapsed. Like many of the Central Asian regimes, Belarus, to some degree Ukraine, but that's complicated. They were doing okay early on. And so you had, anyway, this interesting kind of some dictatorships, lots of these mixed regimes, and some democracies. And so what we've done, and looking at the relationship, how that has affected issues of social mobility, relations between groups, how it has affected issues of economic reform, economic performance, and the like. So that's been one set of questions, is trying to figure out, relatedly, why these mixed regimes tip in certain directions. Why does Russia become an authoritarian regime, by the end of the 90s? Why did it tip more democratic? Why did some regimes tip in a more democratic direction after having been mixed, which is actually Ukraine's example? And there are a bunch of examples we could give. So looking at these regime transitions has been a big issue. The second big issue, obviously, is the struggle over identities and boundaries. And we have spent a huge amount of many studies of this. I would say that was the issue in which many social scientists finally discovered the region. I want to say something in parentheses that's kind of interesting. The university I'm at has a very huge contingent of development studies people. And I have been yelling for 20 years that the post-communist Europe and Eurasia does do development. They're developing places, de-developing, whatever you want to call them. They are actually candidates for study. The Cold War geography, just like the study of authoritarianism, runs very deep. It's really striking. I keep saying, well, why not Kazakhstan? You go, Kazakhstan. Why not whatever? So it's an interesting kind of thing that's happened in the study of post-communism, is that I would argue that the integration in terms of research, definition of the field, bringing new people in, cross-regional studies, et cetera, those of us in the field have failed to, in effect, reintegrate this region with a larger set of studies. That is somewhat less true in Eastern and Central Europe insofar as you talk about things like European studies, EU studies, and the like. But it's very striking to me how segmented we still remain in so many ways. It's an interesting thing to talk about why that has happened, but it's really a huge issue. Okay. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, and then maybe I'll stop there, open it up, is that there has been, the field of Eastern and Central European studies has been radically transformed by young scholars. And it's been, for me, a very, very exciting period, the last 20 years watching this. I don't think it's so exciting when I write all the tenure letters. I think it's very not exciting and all that. We've all had this experience, I'm sure. It's just unbelievable how many people there are in the field now, and many people ended up, and this is interesting, I don't know if this is true, but I have a feeling that there is now more equality between people working on Eurasia and Eastern and Central Europe in terms of numbers. I'd be curious to see if that's true, but I think they're closer in terms of numbers. And part of that simply is because I think Eastern and Central Europe offered such a rich array of research agenda possibilities. And the second thing is that in many cases, they had social scientists with whom external scholars could connect, especially Poland, Hungary, and the former Yugoslavia. To some degree, the Czech Republic, too. And that was a real draw, and the former Soviet Union really was much weaker in that regard. Because the collapse of the Soviet Union was also a crisis for scholars within the Soviet Union. And the kinds of work they did, the definition of the research institutes, and the like. So that was a huge shift. I'm going to stop there. Enough. Yeah. Thanks.